Great. So let's start the meeting. I welcome everyone, ladies and gentlemen, to this event. And I want to thank Professor Hilbert for accepting our invitation. Shiraz University Digital Humanities Student Association is hosting this meeting, and Professor Martin Hilbert has kindly accepted our invitation to join us today, and we are honored to have him here. Professor Martin, thank you. I'm Mirza Barzagar, Head of Digital Humanities Student Association of Shiraz University and also the moderator of this event. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Hilbert. He received his PhD from Rice University after studying Germanic languages at Hamburg University, postdoc at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley, where the initial framework semantic parsing project was developed on the computational and quantitative aspects of his research. Currently, Martin Hilbert holds the position of Vice Rector of Teaching and Professor of English Linguistics at the University of Neuchâtel. His research focuses on three main issues: usage-based linguistics, specifically the framework of construction grammar and the development of corpus-based methodologies, and the combination of experimental and psycholinguistic approaches. He's been the main editor of the Function of Language journal for more than a decade and also the associate editor of the Cognitive Linguistics journal since 2017. The title of today's talk is Distributional Semantics, Methods and Their Application to Linguistic Research. After the talk, Professor Hilbert agreed to answer some questions from the audience afterwards. So let's start. The virtual stage is yours, sir. And I want to thank you once again.
Well, thank you for the invitation and for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be able to talk to you today. Do you hear me all right?
Yes,
is the sound okay?
And the audience can, I guess, hear you if they would, yes, with your positives.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, now I will turn off my webcam so that we can have your video feed clearly. And the Q&A will be at the end of the meeting. Yes, Q&A will be at the end of the meeting. Great.
Yeah.
Please start.
So I'll start sharing my screen. I hope you can see everything all right. And I think I have a little icon. So if anything comes up, post something in the chat and I'll try to react. Yeah. Okay. So you see the topic of my talk for today. Basically, there are three questions that I would like to talk about. That have to do with distributional semantic methods and how they can be applied in a linguistic framework. Now, linguists aren't the only researchers who are working with distributional semantics. Obviously, there are lots of computational applications. So quite often I talk to colleagues, let's say in computer science or computational linguistics, who are using these kind of methods, but what they want to do with that is very different from the kinds of questions that the linguist might ask. And so that would be the goal for the time that I have with you today. Right. So I first want to explain a little bit. So what are semantic vector spaces, and specifically I'm going to talk about type of semantic vector spaces that are called token-based. I'll explain what that means. I'll then have a few examples of what we can do with them. And in the third part of my talk, I will discuss how these tools allow us to study lexical words, grammatical constructions, and how they allow us to address theoretical questions in linguistics. So let's jump right in and look at a few examples. So on this slide, you see different words that describe things that could be found on a farm. So all of these words are semantically related in this way. But of course, if you look at the entire set, they're not all equally similar to each other. In fact, if you were to give these words to a human observer, they would probably tell you that these words fall into three different categories. Namely, there are animal words. So, for example, there's goat and there's cat. Then there are vegetables like, for example, cabbage and carrots. And there are clothing items such as hat and jacket and so on and so forth. Semantic vector spaces do essentially this kind of thing. Yeah, so they categorize words or linguistic units into different categories in the way that mirrors actually the behavior of human language users. All right. Now, on this graph, you see something that corresponds to what I just described, except here, it was actually a computer that categorized the farm words in a way that is very similar to what a human being would have done. Yeah? So we recognize the vegetables in one corner, we have the clothing items in one corner, and we have the animals in one corner. And we actually, if you look at corn and wheat, for example, here the computer tells us that, yeah, they're kind of like vegetables, but they're not quite vegetables. And that actually corresponds to our human intuition that grains are not quite the same thing as potatoes and carrots and things like that. All right. So this, in a nutshell, is what distributional semantics or semantic vector spaces allow us to do. They allow us to study semantic similarity across sets of linguistic elements. And what I would like to do in this talk is related to that, but instead of looking at different words, so what we have here, I will be specifically interested in studying semantic similarity across different uses of the same word. Let me illustrate that. So here you see several examples of the use of a single English noun, the noun wave. And the noun wave in English exhibits what linguists call polysemy. That is, there are several meanings or senses that are instantiated by these examples. So, for example, wave has what we could call a water sense. Yeah? So when there's a breaking wave or when a wave is cresting, so that indicates the movement of water at the beach, maybe. And that is one sense of wave. Wave also has a metaphorical emotion sense. So here somebody is overwhelmed by a wave of homesickness. That's not a literal watery wave, but a metaphorical wave. And in this example, there's a wave of anger. So that's quite common metaphor that emotions are conceptualized as liquids that come in waves, and then you're totally overwhelmed by joy or homesickness or anger or love or anything like that. Yeah. And then there's a third sense in which wave describes an abstract physical phenomenon. Now, so here we have a density wave moving through the stars, or an Ernst equation wave. Don't ask me what that is, yeah, but we can see from the context that what is meant is the physical idea of a wave. All right, and I would say that even we as non-native speakers of English can identify these different senses on the basis of context to the left and right. And the idea of token-based semantic vector spaces is to teach a computer to do the same thing. Now, that is essentially the idea in a nutshell. Let me give you an overview of the next minutes. So I'll try and introduce semantic vector spaces and how they are created in a way that is just a little bit more technical, but not very, very abstract. I'll distinguish between type-based semantic vector spaces and token-based vector spaces. And then I'll try and put the method to work. And I'll show you 3 different things that can be done with these tools. So first, I'll talk about contrasts between elements that have almost the same meaning. I'll talk about contrasts between grammatical meanings. So where we have a grammatical element that has different functions that have related, that have emerged out of one another. And then in the third part, I want to address a theoretical issue and see how these techniques can be used to test hypotheses in a linguistic theory, such as grammaticalization theory. I'll explain in more detail what is meant by that. Yeah, and then I'll finish up with some conclusions and an outlook. Right, let's get going. Semantic vector spaces or distributional semantic methods, these things go by different names. What are they? How can we use them? How can we create them in the first place? There are a couple of work steps that are involved, and I'd like to walk you through the main work steps that are needed. So the first step would be that we choose a set of linguistic elements that we want to analyze, right? So this set is sometimes called a vocabulary. The vocabulary can be relatively small or large, depending on our needs. But in each case, we choose a set of keywords and then we retrieve frequencies of those items and their context items from a linguistic corpus. So now, to make this a little bit more concrete, let's go back to the farm words that I showed you earlier. So let's say that these words here represent our vocabulary. So one thing that we would do in the beginning is just choose this set and put all these words in, well, here I chose a treasure chest in order to symbolize what's going on. My native language is German, and in German, the word vocabulary actually translates into a word treasure, treasure of words, which is why I picked this here. Don't attach too much meaning to it, all right, but once we have our treasure chest with vocabulary items, we will take elements out of it one by one. So here I use the word goat, and I use a text corpus and retrieve instances of that word from the corpus so that I have what's called a concordance, a list of examples with the keyword in the middle and words to the left and right. And usually, so that is the data that we're working with. But before working with the data, we clean it up a little bit by removing items that are grammatical, high-frequency elements, things that don't carry meaning as much as lexical items, so things like punctuation and things like that. Yeah, so this is what you see here. The gray elements are stop words, so we have punctuation, we have pronouns and prepositions and articles, and really all that is left are the lexical items that are in the left and right context of our key word. All right, so what do we do with that data? All of these items, all of these lexical context items of goat are collected in what we could call a bag of words. All right, so all of those items go into the bag of words, which represents the context of the word goat. Yeah. And rather conveniently, these contexts can be turned into frequency word lists. I've shown this here for goat. So basically, what the list tells us, which are the words that appear most often in the context of our keyword. So in this case, the word mountain frequently collocates with goats. Words like to occur with themselves. So if we have one instance of goat, very often close to that keyword, there's another instance of the same word. Words like milk and cheese and so on and so forth, they occur in the vicinity, in the neighborhood of goat. And this is really the basic information the computer works with. Where it gets interesting is when we compare frequency lists of this kind of different words. So we can apply exactly the same logic and take a semantically related words such as cow, and we will notice that, all right, there are certain elements such as milk, for example, that appear in both contexts with roughly similar frequencies or in similar positions in the ranking. And if we have two words that are semantically similar, there should be some overlap in the vocabulary. So between different farm animals, for example, there would be some overlap. So I guess all of them have elements such as meat, for example. And when we take something that is very different semantically, so a clothing item, for example, the collocates will be very different. There might be some overlap still. So, for example, the adjective black, I think it's here. So with the goats, we also have black. There might be some overlap, but all in all, the frequency lists of semantically similar words will show more overlap than, let's say, the frequency lists of an animal word and a clothing item word. And that, in consequence, then leads to the greater semantic distance that we see in visualizations of this data. All right, so we have accomplished our first work step. We've chosen a vocabulary list of words, and we have retrieved the frequencies of context items from a corpus. The next work step, the second work step, is basically just an arrangement of these frequency lists in a table of frequencies. There are different ways of arranging that data, but the way I'm going to show you is where we have the vocabulary items in the columns of the table and the context items in the rows. So here's the empty table. We take the vocabulary items from our treasure chest, and then in the row items, we have all the different context words. And we try and fill every cell with the observed frequencies that we have. So how often does goat occur in the vicinity of cheese? How often does black occur with goat, gray, cells, and so on and so forth? So this this table will be as long as the long list of vocabulary items that we have found with our vocabulary items in the corpus. So it will be a very long corpus, long table, and the width of the table is determined by the size of our vocabulary. So in this case, I think, the example only has some 24 or so items, but you can easily imagine that if you take a larger vocabulary, that's how large your table is going to be. All right, so we fill the table with frequencies, and it's important to note that some of the cells will be zero. So for example, in our data, the words cow and pig don't have the word gray in their concordance lines. All right, this will turn out to be important. I'll come back to this in a second. But what we can do now with this kind of table is that we can compare pairs of vocabulary items mathematically just by looking at the numerical differences for each context item. All right. So we can compare how semantically similar goat and cow are just by looking at these frequencies here. Sometimes they line up and are identical. Sometimes they're very close. Yeah. Sometimes they are more different. Yeah. But essentially, when you subtract one from the other, you can get a sense of how similar these sequences of numbers are. Okay. In mathematical terms, the technical term for this list of frequencies here is a vector. Now, so goat has a vector of frequencies, cow has a vector of frequencies. They're called semantic vectors because the numbers represent words in the context of the vocabulary item. And if two vectors are similar mathematically, that would indicate that the two words are related in terms of their meaning. Right. So the easiest way to handle this would just be to sum up the differences so that if the numbers are very different, we get a large number. If the numbers are very similar, we get a small number. But there's one complication that I'd like to mention at this point, namely, if we have elements that are zero, now, well, just summing up the differences would lead us to think that, there's no difference because the elements are semantically related. However, you can easily imagine if we have two words that are very infrequent, they don't occur very often in the corpus, then many of these corresponding cells would be zero just because the word is infrequent now. And so that is something that we need to keep in mind. There are ways of safeguarding against this kind of problem. I'll be happy to say more about that later on. All right. So far, our table then contains raw co-occurrence frequencies of vocabulary items and context items. And in the construction of a distributional semantic model, those frequencies need to be transformed with what's called a collocation measure. There are different collocation measures that are being used in corpus linguistics and computational linguistics. There are a handful that are typically applied in the construction of distributional semantic models. One of them is called pointwise mutual information. And pointwise mutual information is a technique that allows us to control for precisely such cases where in both cells there is a very low absolute frequency or even zero. Now, all right. So PMI allows us to control for frequency, and that also means that when we have a high frequency word that very often occurs with other words, that might not be because the two are semantically related, but simply because this is a word that is used very often that has a very high chance of appearing with another word. The use of a collocation measure such as PMI also allows us to make the original table smaller because we can delete columns and rows where the resulting PMI values don't exceed a certain threshold. So basically, if nothing interesting is going on in a given column, we can actually get rid of it. Yeah. All right. So, all right, that's the part the next work step that I wanted to mention. Once all of this is in place, we can actually proceed to the visualization of the data. So with the kind of table that we have created, we can actually create visualizations like the ones that you have seen earlier, where the distributional semantic model assesses semantic similarity between all the different vocabulary items in our set, and it identifies those that are very similar to one another. It provides us with a global assessment of how many different clusters of words there are in our vocabulary set. And, it allows us to identify those semantic categories in our data. Right. I want to talk about an extension of this general technique, namely token-based semantic vector space modeling. So this relates to what I've shown you earlier with regard to the different senses of wave. Yeah? So what I want to do is to distinguish different meanings of the same element, so that we can, for example, say, all right, the English word wave has different kinds of meanings that relate to different semantic domains. How is that accomplished? How is that done? So we do this on the basis of the general method that I described to you. And we basically need two things. So the first thing would be a large semantic distributional model in the form of a table of the kind that I've shown you. Yeah. So those kinds of models would be called type-based semantic vector spaces, because the vocabulary items, the vectors that represent those items, they represent types. They represent entire concordances of words such as above, alike, away, and so on and so forth. So this table, this semantic vector space, is a lot larger than the example that I showed you earlier. So here in this model, I did not just include 20 or so farm words, but rather we've tried to model a large vocabulary representing the English language more globally. So there are 20,000 vocabulary items in the rows of the table, and there are as many context items. Yeah. So we know how strongly the word above is associated to a set of 20,000 other words. We have the same information for the words alike, away, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And this will be the basis for the token-based analyses that I'm going to present. Right. So this is the first thing that we need. The second thing that we need are concordance lines for a word that we would like to model. So here's our concordance of wave again. And we use this data, these kinds of concordance lines. And as a first step, we did what we did before with the type-based analysis. We take out all the stop words, so all the grammatical words, all the punctuation elements, high-frequency auxiliary verbs, determiners, and so on and so forth. Right. Then we have the remaining words, and we take the remaining words of the first concordance line, and we put them in a bag of words. Now, admittedly, this is a small bag of words. Yeah, there are only 5 or so elements in them. Yeah, tumbled, breaking, wave, gun, jerked, and sending. And And well, they might already give us an indication of what the sense, what the meaning of wave is in this example, but we need to enrich this information further. All right, so what we do is that we take each word from our concordance line and we look it up in the large type-based semantic vector space that we have. Yeah. So we have the word tumbled, we have the word breaking, we have the word gun, we have jerked, and we have sending. And for each of these, we have this large semantic vector that represents in what contexts words such as tumbled or breaking or gun actually appear. Right. So if we average these values, we get a representation, a vector representation of the concordance line. Yeah. So instead of the 5 words that we have to the left and right of wave, we now have a semantic vector that is a lot richer in terms of the collocational information that is contained in that data. All right, now we don't just want to do this for one concordance line, but we actually do it for all concordance lines that we have. This then gives us a table that, well, structurally looks very similar to what we had earlier. But in this table, each concordance line is represented by one column with lots of collocational values. And we can visualize that information in a graph like the ones that you've seen earlier, where each point represents, well, not a different word, but a single concordance line of the same word. Yeah. So all of these data points here that you see in the graph, coincidentally, it actually looks like a cresting wave, which is kind of nice. All right. So what about the different senses that I talked about? If we inspect the individual concordance lines manually, yeah, so we can look for each individual data point what the concordance line behind it actually is. We can find out which of these data points actually instantiate the water sense of wave. I've marked them up in blue here. And you see that the collocational behavior of these concordance lines allows us to distinguish them quite nicely from the more abstract senses of wave. Yeah, so they appear in a different area of the graph, meaning that, all right, different senses, they map onto different collocational behaviors. Let me just check something's going on in the chat. All right, so someone asked manually. So what I mean by that is that if we're interested in the concordance line that, for example, lies behind this data point here, we can get that information. And actually, I'm getting to this right now. So let's look at this one here, wave. The 14th concordance line of wave. So this line reads, a large wave washing over them. The wave had a great deal of undertow. Yeah, so this is clearly about something that goes on with water at the beach. Yeah? And the words in the concordance line, they, give an indication that is confirmed in the context of the remaining analysis. Let's take another example that is clearly not about water. Yeah? So here we have example number 78. So this line is about a weightlifting federation stung by a wave of positive drug tests. So athletes doing doping, and several of these cases arriving at the same time. Well, that is not about water. that is about, a metaphorical wave, not the scientific or the emotional waves that I talked about earlier, but clearly a metaphorical sense that is different from the watery sense. All right. Okay. I would like to come to practical examples of what can be done with this method. So the example about the different waves that you've just seen, you could say that this is really word sense disambiguation in the domain of lexical words, what's going on. And this is actually what that kind of technique has been designed for originally. However, we can actually, misappropriate the method to do different things with it. And in the following, I want to, illustrate a few things that can be done with the method for slightly different purposes. For example, for contrasting different lexical and grammatical items. All right. So, for example, here you see a visualization where I contrasted concordances of two synonymous verbs synonymous words in English, the adjectives glad and happy. So both convey the idea of being in a positive emotional state. And we might assume or hypothesize that the two should overlap semantically to a great extent. That's actually confirmed by the distributional semantic analysis. But one thing that you observe is that, all right, there are actually lots of contexts where happy is the adjective that is chosen by the speaker. And there are no instances of glad in the same context. And then there's this large semantic area where the two can be used more or less interchangeably. Right? So what might be going on here? I'll give you a little hint. There is there's a traditional song where you wish somebody a happy birthday. So pretty much whenever there's birthday in the context, happy is chosen rather than glad. So you can wish somebody a glad birthday, but that would be very unconventional. Now, all right. Second example, a bit more difficult, maybe. So English has different modal auxiliaries that allow you to express whether something is probable or likely to happen. And so elements like the modal auxiliaries may and might. What you see here is that, they actually overlap to a very, very large extent. And only towards certain fringes of the graph do we see a preference, a relative preference for one or the other. So this kind of result would tell you that we have two elements that are exchangeable to a large extent. And it would be difficult to find examples where it has to be one rather than the other. But that doesn't mean that speakers don't have preferences. So probabilistic preferences, there are contexts in which may is a lot more typical than might, and vice versa. All right. We looked at a lot of different cases of this kind. So here I contrast have to and must, which essentially gives you the same result. The two overlap to a large extent, but there are areas where have to is the more conventional option. For example, when we are dealing with situations that are very informal. So when you have texts where there are lots of second and first person pronouns, lots of contractions. So in those contexts, have to is actually more common, more likely than the near synonymous modal auxiliary must. All right. Let me give you another example. And here I would like to, I was look at this mini concordance of the English modal auxiliary may. And in these concordance lines, it's a little bit like the example of wave. Now, may conveys different meanings, which can be characterized as encoding either possibilities, that is epistemic modality, or permission, what linguists call deontic modality. Yeah, so in one case, you're allowed to do something, and in the other case, it is a theoretical possibility that something is the case. Right. Now, the main point that I want to make is that the meaning of may in an example such as this one here, some of you may know this story. It's different from its meaning in this line here, you may go. So this is a permission, and the red ones, they encode possibilities. And the question is, can we distinguish these meanings on the basis of the context items that we find to the left and right of may in these concordances? So in order to find that out, I took corpus data, and I started by doing some manual annotation. Yeah, so I manually distinguished examples that convey the meaning of a permission and meanings that convey the idea of a possibility. And then I took all those examples and created a distributional semantic model, and I checked whether just on the basis of the context item, so the computational model didn't have access to my manual coding, whether the difference in meaning would be reflected in the way that the different instances of may are shown in a visualization. And here you see on this graph that actually turns out to be the case. Yeah? So the split is a lot cleaner than what you saw a minute ago with just where we take all the instances of may and might and try to contrast them. That's actually a lot more messy. But here we get, at least a clear tendency. Yeah? So there's an area in the middle where there's overlap, but towards the sides of the graph, there are areas where it's pretty much clear to the model whether it's one or the other. All right. So let's look at some of these examples and let's see what is going on in the individual concordance lines. So here we have an example where the words that were that appeared in the concordance lines that were then looked up in the large type-based vector were ratio, biological, for example, which was annotated as one single item, and tropical. And just on the basis of these items, the token-based distributional model actually comes up with the prediction that, all right, so this should be part of the epistemic category rather than the deontic category. If we look at an example on the other side of the graph, so here we have words like elected, honorary, treasurer. Please is probably a giveaway item. So if we have please in the context, that is a strong hint that something of a permission is being asked for. And so here the model predicts that should be a deontic example rather than an epistemic example. Okay, now let's maybe look at two examples where the method had a little bit of trouble with the classification. So, for example, you see here, there's an epistemic example that is deep in deontic territory. And the words that appear in this concordance line include gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. And these words, well, ladies and gentlemen, they frequently occur in deontic examples, and this is what leads the method astray in this particular case. If we take the opposite problem, so here we have a deontic example that is misclassified, so to speak, as epistemic. We have words such as flows, traffic, answers, time. So a human speaker probably wouldn't have any trouble at all identifying the meaning of this concordance line as asking for permission, because there is the set phrase "if I may" in it. So when you hear "if I may," well, that's a conventionalized way of asking for permission. And that would lead us naturally to the interpretation that, it's deontic. However, the analysis didn't have access to that kind of information. It only had the words that are shown in bold here. So if and I are included in the stop words that we deleted from our analysis, and so our method has no way of exploiting that information. Okay, I'm doing a little parenthesis here. There are type-based distributional semantic methods, and there are token-based distributional semantic methods. So the token-based is what we're looking at here. But orthogonal to the type-based, token-based distinction, there is also a distinction between methods that are constructed like the one that you see here, where we start with corpus data and frequencies and corpora and collocation measures, and that's how we build our distributional semantic model. Those are called, in the literature, count-based models, okay? And there's a second family of models that are called prediction-based models. They are created in a way that is different. They are created on the basis of machine learning techniques that actually take into account the grammatical items and the sequence of items, and not just words one by one, but also chunks of sequences of words. So they are somewhat more powerful than count-based models. And in all honesty, they are also more successful with a range of different tasks that can be solved with them. All right. So just full disclosure, you're looking at account-based models here, and some of the shortcomings of this analysis, they're actually overcome by the more complex prediction-based models. All right. I want to have one last element in this talk that I want to get to, where I'd like to put the method to work in order to test a hypothesis of grammaticalization theory. So what I've shown you so far can be taken as proof of concept that token-based semantic vector spaces work nicely as a tool that performs practical computational tasks that relate to meaning. And a good question, of course, would be to ask whether this technique can be applied to questions that have some theoretical significance. All right. In order to get to the question, I would like to do a little live experiment here. I would like you to think of 3 words that come to mind when you hear the word paddle, and maybe we can use the chat to do that. Okay, I see some suggestions coming in. Boat, lake, yeah. Any other thoughts? Swan, why not? Yeah. Snorkeling, like that. Okay. Orange. That's random, but I'll take it. I'll take. Okay, tell you what. If I look at boat, lake, and swan, and the common denominator between those, I would say that we could probably agree that the idea of water is one that comes up when you think of the word paddle. Now, if we stand this thing on its head, and what do you imagine people will write down as their first association when they hear the word water? Okay, so here's the word water. What kind of words to associate with water? They'll probably write drink or rain or something. Now, sea, river, and so on and so forth. But they won't necessarily give you the word paddle. So there is an asymmetry in the semantic relation between paddle and water. Let me illustrate this. So paddle, the word paddle strongly leads you to the idea of water, but conversely, the idea of water doesn't lead you to the idea of paddle with the same strength. Okay, so that would be the idea. So this phenomenon has been called asymmetric priming. Yeah? And there is a linguistic paper that I found very interesting that talks about this and that relates it to issues of language change. So let me read this quote to you. So in this paper, Jäger and Rosenbach argue that the psycholinguistic mechanism of priming may account for the empirical observation that grammaticalization processes typically proceed in one direction only. So in semantic change and grammaticalization, there's typically a starting point with something that is concrete and specific, and semantic change makes these elements more abstract and more schematic. So phrased in another way, they say that very generally, the prediction is that in any reported case of change, where the development goes unidirectionality from A to B, A should prime B, but not vice versa. Right. How can we think of this? Well, imagine that you are out on the street and you meet a friend of yours, and your friend tells you, "I'm going to the station." The asymmetric priming hypothesis would predict that even though your friend just talked about the act of walking, going, you would be actually likely to think about your friend's future actions. So he's going to the station. What is going to happen then? Is he going to catch his train? What is he doing? Where is he going to? And so on and so forth. Now, conversely, if you are, let's say, talking on the phone and your friend who you're talking to tells you, "Oh no, I'm going to miss my train," that should not lead you to think about the act of walking. Okay, so that would be the idea of an asymmetric priming. lexical going should prime grammatical be going to, but grammatical be going to, which is what we have here, should not prime lexical going. All right. How does this connect to distributional semantics? Let me explain. Yeah. So here we have another concordance. This time it's the word since. And what we're trying to do now is to create a semantic vector space that shows the different meanings that are, that can be conveyed by the word since. How do we do that? Well, again, we exclude all the stop words. We take the remaining elements that are in the concordance lines, and we do the same kind of representation where we take the context items and have them in a bag of words that represents the individual concordance line. And then, like we did before, we create semantic representations of that concordance line by looking up its context items in a large type-based semantic vector space. So for concordance line 1, we have advantage, drugs, toxic, and materials. We add up their colloquial vectors, and that gives us a single long vector that is the representation of since in this concordance line. And we do that for all the concordance lines that we have. Yeah. On the basis of that, we create a vector space that we can visualize, that allows us to see the semantic differences between different examples and the semantic spectrum of since. Now, one thing that I need to tell you about these examples is that there are different meanings of since in these concordance lines. So the second since, so since the change of government last weekend, that is expressing a temporal relation. So something happened before, and since then something else has been going on. And the first and the third, they express causal relations. So since drugs are toxic materials, that means because drugs are toxic materials. And since uranium reserves are finite, that means, because these reserves are finite. Okay, now this semantic difference between temporal and causal, that actually shows up in a visualization of a larger concordance of since that I'm showing you here. So here you see a token-based semantic vector space of several hundred concordance lines of since. And again, there's no perfect separation of temporal and causal since. It's clear enough that here towards the right, we have a clustering of causal examples. And over here, we have a large area of the graph where the meaning is only temporal and not causal. So put very simply, temporal and causal since have distinct collocational preferences. All right. This relates to asymmetric priming. Let me explain how. Yeah. Now, according to the asymmetric priming hypothesis, there should be an asymmetry so that temporal since should prime causal since, but not the other way around. And how can we find out whether this is actually the case, whether speakers are actually influenced by temporal since and causal since in different ways? For this, I looked at corpus data, and specifically at corpus data where two instances of since would follow one another in a relatively short context window. Yeah. So the logic would be this. If two instances of since follow one another we should more often see switches from temporal to causal than the other way around. Yeah. So because temporal should prime causal, but not the other way around. Okay. Now in corpus data, we can actually find examples where we have several instances of since in relatively short sequence. So here we have an example where we have one instance. The first is temporal, and then a couple of lines further down, there's another instance. So the first I would call the prime, and in this case, the prime conveys temporal meaning. And the second example I call the target. Here, in this case, the meaning that is conveyed is also temporal. Now, sequences that instantiate the same category might still tell us something if we look at them in the visualization of the token-based semantic vector space. Namely, it could be that, the first one is clearly temporal, and the second one is maybe a little bit further towards the gray area in the middle. All right. Let's look again at the token-based semantic vector space, and let's actually see what happens in the data. All right, this looks a little bit messy, but let me explain what you see in this graph. Let's maybe start with the table that we have at the top. So the table shows you the primes and the targets. And you see for each cell, how often the pairings from temporal to temporal, from causal to causal, from causal to temporal, and from temporal to causal actually occur. All right. What you see in the table is that most pairings are actually within the same category. So that when we have a causal prime, it's very likely that we also have a causal target. When we have a temporal prime, it's very likely that we also have a temporal target. So essentially what is going on is self-priming. Now, what goes on with regard to causal primes and temporal targets? So this would be not expected at all, according to the asymmetric priming hypothesis. And indeed, we see that, there are only 7 instances of these, whereas we would expect, just by pure chance, more than 30 of them. And when we look at the stuff that would be expected from temporal to causal, according to the asymmetric priming hypothesis, we also see that that is very much underrepresented. So we find only 12 instances where this happens. We would expect 36 just by chance. Okay. Now, another prediction of the asymmetric priming hypothesis would be that primes and targets in the semantic vector space should often be semantically related in such a way that the targets are further to the right than the primes. So they should be further in the causal domain rather than in the temporal domain. The bad news is that this doesn't really seem to be the case. So I checked the direction and distance between primes and targets for all pairs. And if you do the math, if you look for the general behavior of the differences, there's no reliable drift towards causal meaning between one and the other. All right. So on the whole, the corpus-based example of temporal and causal sense does not provide support for the asymmetric priming hypothesis. Now, you might say that this is just one example, and perhaps there are other cases where we would see a reliable difference, a drift towards the more grammaticalized meaning. So I looked at other linguistic elements and analyzed, examples where one instance would follow another. And essentially, we see the same kind of result. Yeah? So here we have the lexical verb used and the habitual grammaticalized variant used to, as in he used to come down here very often. Again, I checked for how often a lexical use was followed by a habitual one, how often a habitual use was followed by a lexical one. There are no clear tendencies. The same for lexical got, as in I got a present, versus modal got, as I got to go now. No priming asymmetry there either. And just for good measure, let's return to deontic may and epistemic may. Again, there's no asymmetric priming going there either. All right. What we do find in all cases, though, is that first, the token-based semantic vector spaces allow us to discriminate between the different meaning categories. So there's always some kind of distribution that we have one category on one side and another category on the other. And in all cases, we also find strong effects of within category priming. So if you have a deontic example, chances are that the next element will also be deontic. All right, so priming effects are there. It's just not the ones that the asymmetric priming hypothesis would predict. All right, with that, I'd like to round things off and present you a few conclusions. So I hope to have convinced you that token-based semantic vector spaces are an interesting computational tool that is at our disposal. It's a tool that allows us to look at entire concordances at a single glance. It allows us to see different senses of the same word. It allows us to see what different meaning clusters they may be in the polysemy of an item. They allow us to see whether the context words of a given word provide a good distinction of different meanings. We can see what kinds of distinctions are captured and what distinctions are maybe more difficult to capture. Yeah? So think of the different metaphorical meanings of wave, for example. And then the method also provides us with a range of advantages. So it succeeds at discriminating between different meanings of grammatical elements, not just lexical ones. The method allows us to check out interesting examples, either because they are very clearly identified by the method or because they're ambiguous. And then a closer qualitative analysis of individual examples can help us analyze words and patterns that are relevant for the semantic distinctions that we observe. And in a broader context, the method can help us test theoretical hypotheses that may be interesting in a broader context. There are also some challenges that I'd like to talk about. So as I told you, the method that I've presented to you has been designed for lexical elements and it ignores grammatical stop words. So prediction-based models have found a way around that. And you may have heard of distributional semantic models that have been pre-trained, where you can actually use a technique out of the box, such as BERT, for example, is one prediction-based model. And these prediction-based models are a lot more powerful and are actually the way forward. So there's a lot of work going on that tries to make these models more reliable, more powerful, and that tries to adapt them to different kinds of research questions. All right. And with that, I'd actually like to come to an end. I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'd also like to thank my team members who've been implicated in the work that I've been talking about. So there's David Correa Saavedra and Susanne Flach. They have been working together with me on these issues. And so with that, I think I would like to get back to you guys, stop sharing my screen, and see if you have any questions.
Great. So let's. I want everyone to. Anyone who has questions, please raise their hands and ask Dr. Hilberg themselves.
Hello, do you have my voice?
Yep.
Can you hear me? I can hear. Sorry, just a minute. Okay, so yes, I want to ask you a question. I was working on something, actually, I haven't started yet. I'm going to work on the journals of Sylvia Plath, actually.
Okay.
And I'm going to make a corpus out of it to figure out the effects of the ECT, or the electric shock therapy that she received.
Okay.
And so I wanted to see that can we do the same of the vector vocabulary checking on feelings or emotionals, or the words related to emotions and such stuff? Can we do like the 2-dimension graphs for the words related to feelings and emotions too?
All right. Super interesting project. If you focus on, let's say, a set of keywords that you hypothesize would have changed from before electroshock therapy to after, in that kind of scenario, the method that I've described would be able to to show you whether there was some kind of drift or a change happening. One thing that I need to say is that the methods that I've shown, they are relatively data intensive. So when you are using them on the basis of single authors, one potential difficulty might be that there is simply not enough data of one single author that allows the model to fully work. Now, with prolific writers like Sylvia Plath, that may actually not be a problem, but depending on how much data you have for different periods of their creative career, there might be a data problem potentially.
Like a 10-year period, or don't like that. Would it cause a problem?
I would say you have tens of thousands of words for one author, if you're in these orders of magnitude, then it might actually be possible to do something meaningful.
Thank you very much. And I would say that it was an honor to have you here. I really enjoyed that.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Very much.
Great. So does anyone else have questions? I guess if there are any person who are interested in asking a question, please raise your hand. If not, I'm going to ask a question myself. Okay, so regarding this model, do we have to are they manually annotated? And if yes, do we have to divide our data to test and train to based on this model? Do we need to do that just like other AI training things to validate whether our model is working correctly or not?
Mm-hmm.
Precision and
so I have to say, if I were to get into these kinds of methods now, let's say as a master level student or a doctoral student, I'd probably get into pre-trained models such as BERT and see how I can work with these pre-trained models where, one benefit would be there's already a community of people working with these methods. So there's a large literature. There are, people that you could ask with regard to how do you do this? How do I get started? And so on and so forth. And of course, it takes a lot of preparatory work out of the equation. The reason that I started from scratch, so to speak, was so I started a while ago when a lot less was available. And also I was a total newbie, and I wanted to see for myself how everything builds up. And what really goes into the method and the models. So I feel that I can understand things better if I can build things myself. And
that's absolutely right.
And of course, that is that's maybe not a luxury that you have when you have half a year to write a master's thesis, for example. So
that's.
Everyone's situation will be a little different. Someone in the comments, so Daria in the comments asked, can you recommend some books or some resources? I can. So I would suggest that I email Merzad a couple of papers once we're done, and then you can distribute this to people who are interested. Yeah.
Great. That would be awesome. And if you it's okay if you could share the slides as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no problem.
Listing it here. Great. Thank you. And so one final question, don't you see large language models as a threat to such, let's say, methods, they're carefully crafted ones instead of very text-based, heavy, as you said, it relies on a large corpora-based text.
Yeah, so a lot of what's going on in large language models like ChatGPT is this. Yeah. So essentially, what you've seen is kind of the underlying logic that informs large language models. So if a large language model is able to produce text that looks meaningful to human language users, it is because it has been trained with exactly this kind of information. So meanings of words in large language models are represented as vectors that capture what goes on in the context of a given word. Now, maybe one difference between in the count-based type model, that the one that I presented to you, there it is not completely a black box how the meanings of words are represented or how the model even gets there. In the prediction-based models, sometimes this is exaggerated in discussions, that you have journalists writing, the researchers themselves can't explain why ChatGPT talks in the way that it does. That is true and false at the same time. So we know what kind of decisions go into large language models, and how what the general principles are that the model applies. But
That's
in
right.
the end, you wouldn't be able to let's say, write a prompt for ChatGPT and with pen and paper write out what ChatGPT would do automatically. So I don't think anybody. So that's no longer possible. Whereas I could on pen and paper, with pen and paper, take one concordance slide, look up the context vectors and average them manually, and that would still be possible. I can look under every piece of I can look into every piece of the process. Now, back to your general question. Are large language models a danger or a threat, or something to be worried about, not only with regard to linguistics, but maybe even more generally? So a lot of the worries concern, for example, education and the way the way that students and people in the workplace interact or produce and consume texts. There are definitely questions that are important to ask. But now, ChatGPT has been around for a bit more than a year. And when it first came out, so November 22, I think it was 22, we were promised a complete revolution, that nothing would be the same, and that we would be out of, so that the economies and jobs would be completely uprooted
revolution
within a few months. And
education.
so things are different, but the big bang, I would say, has not happened in the way that in the way it had been predicted. There certainly are things that are different. I'm not trying to but generally we're still here.
Yes. Great. Yeah, of course. Another question, since you worked on, say, Germanic languages, what about other languages that are less globally represented, such as Farsi, Hebrew, Arabic, especially those right to left direction, and other the language that there isn't enough data on them, or some sort of, let's say, fresh, we don't have that sort of large corpora that are in English, I don't know, BCIN and other corporas. But like how can we go toward that way of construction grammar and also such models, distributional semantics?
Yeah. So it's clear that there is a gigantic asymmetry between the resources that are available for large languages and the resources that are available for lesser spoken and lesser written languages. And maybe one danger to be aware of is that, there are lots of resources available for smaller languages that aren't really native to those languages, but that work with automatic translation and then piggyback on resources that are available for English. And in many cases, that can have downstream effects that are, that greatly reduce the quality and usability. So I would say it takes researchers that are familiar with the general way in which the resources are developed and how they function, so that they can construct things from the ground up in the smaller languages. That's easy for me to say, of course, but I think.
Takes a lot of effort.
So. At least one thing that is positive is that also for so-called smaller languages, the availability of data is actually better than it has ever been before. So the availability of written language data, I think, by harvesting data from the internet or social media platforms, it's certainly possible to get the critical mass of data that is necessary.
Absolutely right.
So with regard to spoken data, that's actually an example of the problem that I described earlier. So there's very powerful speech recognition software, but training that software on the particularities of individual languages, that is sometimes not straightforward if the software, the software has been trained on model languages that are typically large languages. Yeah. And just as a little parenthesis, so speech recognition software is not only discriminating, so to speak, against smaller languages, it also fails very, very quickly if it's not the standard dialect of the large language that it's supposed to work with. Yeah. So, for example, so standard English pieces of speech recognition, they work really, really bad for, let's say, African American English, for example, or Latino English. It's but there are people working on making that better and addressing those problems.
That's English is, yeah, true. That's right. Yeah. Great. So thank you for having this wonderful lecture. It was amazing. Deliverance, everything. I want to thank you very much. And also thanking the participants for being here. So I guess we can call it a day if there aren't any questions and concerns. Any comments?
If there's anything that comes to your mind, you can write me an email and I'll try to respond.
Great, sure. I will share your email with the channel of our association so that they can be in contact with you directly. Perfect. If they want to.
All right.
Thank you very much. Great.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Take care. Thank you. مرسی از همه عزیزانی که ما رو همراهی کردن. میتونید فایل ضبط شده رو توی کانال انجمن قرار میدم. اگر سوالی، پیشنهادی، هر چیزی هست لطفاً داشته باشیم اینجا. و اگه نقد اوکی. So it's DHC آیدی چنل انجمن هستش. DHC underline Shiraz U. اینجا برنامه‌های دیگه میذاریم، برنامه‌های بین‌المللی بیشتری در راهه. اگر با کانکشن هایی که در ارتباطین، کسایی که میدونین واقعا علاقه دارن، پیگیر هستن، در ارتباط باشین، یعنی در میون بذارین برنامه رو و خیلی لطف میکنین. مرسی از همگی. روز بخیر.